Sign it and get out. The 3-year contract is over. Look at the clock, Jane. You are officially nothing to me.
A penny for your thoughts, Jane? Or are you too busy calculating how much alimony you can try to squeeze out of us? Don't bother. The Prashov with exactly what you came with. 0. Get out of my house!
She pulled a cheap burner phone from her pocket and dialed a number she hadn't permitted herself to touch in 3 long years. The call connected on the first ring. An elderly, authoritative voice answered, trembling with instant emotion. "Young mistress, is the trial over?" Jane looked back up at the towering, glowing logo of Vance Global dominating the city skyline. A cold, brilliant smile spread across her lips. "The contract is over, Uncle Edward," Jane said into the receiver. "Call a meeting of the board directors. The heiress of the Rothschild Group is coming home." To the world, the Rothschild Group was an untouchable, mythical titan of global industry. They owned the shipping lanes, the major tech infrastructure, the prime real estate, and the private banks that funded entire countries. To the world, the Vance family were wealthy elites. But to the Rothschilds, the Vances were mere children playing with blocks in a sandbox. What Julian Vance, his arrogant father Arthur, and the rest of the high society vultures never knew was that Jane Sterling was a pseudonym. She was actually Jane Sterling Rothschild, the sole granddaughter and absolute heir to the entire Rothschild lineage. Her grandfather, the legendary Marcus Rothschild, had been a man of brutal wisdom. On his deathbed, he had looked at Jane and said, "Generational wealth breeds parasites, Jane. If you want to rule this empire, you must first know what it feels like to have nothing. You must see how people treat you when you have no power, so you can learn who to trust and who to destroy." The terms of the inheritance were absolute. Jane had to live for 3 years, completely cut off from the family wealth, under a common name, earning a living through standard means, unquote, without relying on a single Rothschild connection. During her first week of the trial, when she was working a standard corporate desk job, she had met Julian. He was charismatic, driven, and under immense pressure to save his family's struggling firm, Vance Global. Julian's grandfather, an old acquaintance of Marcus Rothschild, had recognized Jane. Sensing an opportunity to save his family's legacy, the dying Vance patriarch had proposed a contract to Jane, marry Julian for 3 years to give him the stability of a wife required by the family trust, and in exchange, keep the secret. Jane, genuinely infatuated by Julian's sharp ambition and naive to his darker nature, had agreed, seeing it as the perfect crucible to bide her time while fulfilling her grandfather's test. But Julian had never seen her as a partner. The day his grandfather died, Julian transferred all his resentment for the forced marriage onto Jane. He viewed her as a calculated gold digger who had manipulated an old man into giving her a piece of the Vance fortune. For 3 years, Jane endured the prison of his arrogance. She watched him transfer Vance Global's mounting debts into hidden shell companies. She watched him humiliate her at dinners, introducing her to business partners as "my domestic coordinator" rather than his wife. She cleaned his home, tolerated his mistress Victoria publicly flaunting their affair on social media, and bore the weight of his psychological cruelty. But she had kept her eyes open. Every evening while Julian was out carousing, Jane sat in her small study, analyzing Vance Global's public financial filings, mapping out their supply chain vulnerabilities, and memorizing the names of every corrupt board member her husband associated with. She wasn't just surviving her grandfather's trial. She was conducting a forensic audit of her enemy. The moment she stepped into the sleek, black Maybach that pulled up to the curb the night of her divorce, the humble housewife died. Uncle Edward, the loyal chief counsel of the Rothschild estate, handed her a warm towel and a tablet displaying live market feeds. "Welcome back, Madam CEO," Edward said softly, his eyes reflecting immense respect. "The board has been thoroughly briefed. Your grandfather's chairs are prepared for your arrival. What are your orders?" Jane wiped the rainwater and the faint trace of blood from her face. When she opened her eyes, They were like polished steel. Vance Global has been bleeding cash trying to fund their new logistics infrastructure, Jane stated, her fingers flying across the tablet screen with practiced corporate precision. They've taken out high-interest short-term loans through secondary banks, thinking their upcoming public stock offering will bail them out. Who holds those loans, Edward? Through our subsidiary banks, we hold roughly 65% of their total corporate debt, mistress, Edward replied with a grim smile. Excellent, Jane whispered, leaning back into the leather seat. Call in the loans, liquidate their secondary credit lines, and begin aggressively, quietly, buying up every single public share of Vance Global that hits the market. By the time Julian realizes the water is boiling, I want him completely trapped in the pot. 4 months passed, and to Julian Vance, life without Jane felt like a massive promotion. He had moved Victoria into the penthouse, spent millions on public relations campaigns to brand himself as the city's most eligible bachelor-turned-corporate savior, and focused entirely on the launch of Vance Global's new automated shipping ports, a project that was supposed to catapult his company into the multi-billion-dollar league. Yet beneath the glittering surface, a phantom rot had set in. "What do you mean the liquidity pool is frozen?" Julian shouted, slamming his fist onto his mahogany desk. His executive assistant, a terrified young man named Mark, trembled as he held a stack of financial reports. "Sir, the Alpha Prime Lending Group unexpectedly pulled our rolling credit line this morning," Mark stammered. "They cited an unacceptable shift in risk profile. Without that credit line, we can't pay the dock workers or the software engineers for the port launch next week." "Then go to the secondary lenders. Call Apex Bank. Call the Maritime Trust," Julian ordered, his veins bulging against his collar. "We did, sir," Mark said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They all refused. In fact, Apex Bank has issued a formal notice. They are calling in our existing $800 million construction loan. We have exactly 7 days to pay it in full, or they will initiate foreclosure on our primary logistics hub." Julian sank into his chair, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. This was impossible. Vance Global was a legacy firm. They had premier credit. Someone was systematically suffocating his company, cutting off every oxygen supply before they could even launch their savior project. The door to his office burst open, and his father, Arthur Vance, stormed in. Arthur's hair was disheveled, his expensive silk tie askew. "Julian, have you seen the market tickers? Someone is shorting our stock into the ground while simultaneously executing a massive, coordinated dark pool buyout of our voting shares. We're losing control of the company." "Who is it, Father?" Julian asked, his voice cracking with a rising panic he had never experienced before. "Is it the Murphys? The Lincolns? Who has that kind of capital?" "We don't know!" Arthur roared. "The buying is being routed through an anonymous institutional custody account managed by the Rothschild Group. We tried to get a meeting with their regional director, but we were completely ignored. They won't even take our phone calls." Julian gripped the edge of his desk. The Rothschild Group. The name alone was enough to strike terror into any executive. If they were targeting Vance Global for a hostile takeover, it wasn't a corporate battle, it was an execution. "Wait," Julian said, trying to stabilize his breathing, his mind racing to find a loophole. "The Rothschilds don't do blind executions. They are a profit-driven empire. If they are buying our shares and holding our debt, they don't want us bankrupt, they want us compliant. They want an acquisition. An acquisition means we lose the legacy, Julian," Arthur hissed. "We become glorified branch managers in our own grandfather's company." "It's better than prison and total ruin, Father," Julian said through grit teeth. "If we launch the ports under their umbrella, we can negotiate a buyback clause over 10 years. We just need to get in front of the decision-maker. Who is running the Rothschild operations in this sector now?" Arthur swallowed hard, pulling a crumpled press brief from his jacket pocket. "That's the strangest part. Old Marcus Rothschild passed away earlier this year." the board quietly appointed his sole granddaughter as the absolute CEO of the global conglomerate. She's been operating in total secrecy for months, but she just arrived in the city to personally oversee the restructuring of local assets. A granddaughter? Julian's eyes narrowed. A spark of his old arrogant confidence flared back to life. A young heiress. Probably a spoiled, silver-spoon socialite who had inherited a throne she didn't know how to wield. He had dealt with women like that his entire life. They were easily charmed, easily manipulated, and intimidated by raw corporate aggression. "Schedule an emergency briefing with her office," Julian commanded, standing up and straightening his jacket. "Tell them Vance Global is prepared to lay out a comprehensive partnership proposal. If she's a young, inexperienced heiress looking to make a splash with her first major acquisition, I will give her exactly what she wants on paper, while we secure our assets behind the scenes." "She doesn't take meetings, Julian," Arthur warned. "Her legal team has built a wall around her." "Then tell them we will agree to a total financial disclosure," Julian countered ruthlessly. "Tell them the Vance family will personally present our forensic ledgers. Every woman has a price, Father, and every rookie CEO wants to feel powerful. We will play into her ego, save our skin, and figure out how to claw our way back later." Inside the sprawling, ultra-modern skyscraper of the Rothschild Group's regional headquarters, Jane stood before a massive electronic wall displaying the real-time destruction of Vance Global's financial portfolio. The red graphs were plunging, a beautiful, chaotic downward spiral that represented the total annihilation of Julian's life's work. Edward walked into the high-tech war room, holding an electronic tablet. End of quote. "Madam CEO, Julian Vance has just submitted a formal request for an emergency boardroom briefing. He has offered total asset disclosure in exchange for a direct meeting with you." Jane didn't turn around. She watched a block of 500,000 Vance Global shares get swallowed up by her corporate entity. Did he request the meeting with the Rothschild CEO, or did he use my name? "He has no idea who you are, mistress," Edward chuckled softly. Their legal team addressed the request to the office of the chairperson. Julian's exact words to our intake secretary were that he wanted to personally welcome the young heiress to the market and ensure a mutually beneficial transition. Jane let out a soft, melodic laugh that carried a terrifyingly cold edge. "He thinks I'm a child. He thinks I'm a debutante he can smile at, take to a charity gala, and manipulate into a soft contract." She turned around, her charcoal gray power suit flawlessly tailored, her razor-sharp asymmetrical bob perfectly framing her porcelain face. The faint scar on her cheek from the paper cut had healed into a tiny, almost invisible white line, a permanent receipt of the day she woke up. "Accept the meeting, Edward," Jane ordered calmly. "Schedule it for tomorrow at 11 a.m. in the main executive boardroom on the 50th floor. Tell them the CEO will personally review their terms. A team. Should we prepare the standard non-disclosure terms for the acquisition, ma'am?" "No," Jane said, stepping toward the grand glass windows, looking down at the city below like a monarch surveying her domain. "Prepare the total liquidation paperwork. And, Edward, make sure the room is kept cold. I want them shivering before I even walk through the door." That evening, the Vance penthouse was a war zone of a different kind. Documents were scattered across the floor, half-empty coffee cups stained the marble countertops, and Victoria was throwing a furious tantrum. "What do you mean we can't go to the Hamptons this weekend, Julian?" she shrieked, tossing a designer shoe against the wall. "I already booked the yacht. My friends are expecting us." "Shut up, Victoria!" Julian roared, his face pale, bags heavy under his eyes. "We are facing a multi-billion-dollar margin call in 12 hours. If this meeting with the Rothschild CEO doesn't go perfectly tomorrow, we won't have a yacht. We won't have this penthouse. We will be living in a state-issued cell." Victoria gasped, her selfishness briefly giving way to genuine fear. "But you're Julian Vance. You always fix things. Can't you just buy them off?" "You can't buy off the people who print the money, you idiot!" Julian slammed his laptop shut. He rubbed his temples, his mind involuntarily drifting to a memory from 6 months ago. He remembered coming home stressed after a brutal board meeting. The penthouse had been completely silent. Jane had spent 4 hours preparing a traditional, home-cooked brisket, his favorite meal, hoping to comfort him. He had taken one look at the plate, flipped the table over, scattering food across the pristine floor, and screamed at her for being a low-class, useless anchor dragging down his social status. She had quietly, without a word, knelt on the floor and cleaned up every piece of broken ceramic with her bare hands, cutting her fingers in the process, while he walked out to spend the night at Victoria's hotel. For some reason, the memory of her silent resilience haunted him tonight. Why didn't she ever fight back? He wondered suddenly. Why did she just take it? "Julian, honey," Victoria murmured, snapping him out of his thoughts as she wrapped her arms around his neck, trying to use her usual charms. "Don't worry. Tomorrow, you'll walk into that boardroom, you'll flash that brilliant smile, and that little Rothschild girl won't know what hit her. She'll be signing whatever you want by noon." Julian looked at Victoria's heavily made-up face, feeling a sudden, strange wave of revulsion. For 3 years, Jane's face had been entirely natural, pure, and calm. Victoria's presence suddenly felt incredibly loud, cheap, and exhausting. "Yeah," Julian muttered, pulling away from her touch and staring out at the dark city. Tomorrow, everything changes. He had no idea how right he was. The morning sun offered no warmth inside the monolithic glass tower of the Rothschild Group. At exactly 10:45 a.m., the Vance family limousine pulled up to the private executive entrance. Julian, Arthur, and a rigidly nervous Victoria stepped out. They were flanked by 4 senior corporate attorneys carrying thick leather briefcases containing Vance Global's last desperate defense parameters. As they rode the private high-speed elevator up to the 50th floor, the silence was deafening. The digital screen on the elevator wall tracked their ascent. Floor 30, floor 40, floor 50. The doors slid open with a soft, melodic chime. They were greeted by a stark, ultra-minimalist reception area made entirely of white marble and dark glass. A dozen security guards, dressed in flawless black suits, stood at absolute attention. The atmosphere didn't feel like a corporate headquarters. It felt like the inner sanctum of a military command post. A senior executive assistant greeted them without a smile. "The Vance delegation, follow me." Follow. They were led down a long, wide corridor flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire metropolis. Finally, the assistant opened a set of heavy, reinforced double doors made of polished obsidian wood. The boardroom was colossal. In the center sat a 40-foot-long single slab of rare African mahogany, polished to a mirror shine. The air conditioning was blaring. The room was freezing, exactly as Jane had ordered. Julian adjusted his silk tie, his fingers unusually slick with sweat. He took a seat on the left side of the table, flanked by Arthur and Victoria. His lawyers laid out their tablets and portfolios. Across the table, 5 high-ranking Rothschild executive directors sat in absolute silence, their expressions completely unreadable. They didn't look like people open to negotiation. They looked like a jury waiting for the executioner to arrive. 20 minutes late, Arthur hissed under his breath, fiercely tapping his gold fountain pen against his tablet. "The Rothschild Group is deliberately freezing us out." "Julian, are you absolutely certain your contact," said the CEO, "would review the bailout terms today?" "They confirmed it twice, Father," Julian said, his eyes scanning the empty, high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. His chest felt tight. The sheer, crushing weight of the Rothschild empire was palpable in this room. Vance Global was hemorrhaging cash. If they didn't sign a restructuring deal by noon, trading would halt on the public exchange, and their family legacy would disintegrate into historic bankruptcy. The new CEO personally requested this meeting. Suddenly, the heavy obsidian double doors at the back of the room clicked. The 5 Rothschild directors instantly stood up in perfect unison, their heads bowed slightly in absolute reverence. 2 junior associates stepped in first, flanking the entrance. Then came Uncle Edward, carrying a thick leather folio. Finally, the sharp, rhythmic, unmistakable snap of high-heeled shoes echoed against the polished marble threshold. Julian stood up instinctively, a practiced, charming smile spreading across his face as he prepared to greet the young heiress. He took a deep breath, smoothing down his custom jacket. "Madam CEO, we appreciate you taking the time to—" The words died in his throat. His jaw froze mid-sentence, his eyes widening until they strained against his sockets. The woman walking into the room was draped in a tailored, charcoal gray 3-piece suit that screamed old money, unyielding power, and absolute authority. Her dark hair was cut into a razor-sharp, asymmetrical bob that framed a face striking in its cold perfection. On her left cheek, a tiny, almost imperceptible white line caught the harsh fluorescent light of the boardroom. It was a face Julian had looked at every day for 3 years. A face he had thrown a stack of legal papers at 6 months ago. "Jane?" Victoria gasped, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, horrified shriek as she bolted upright, her manicured nails digging into her designer handbag so hard a nail snapped. Arthur's gold fountain pen rolled completely off the table, hitting the floor with a heavy clack before rolling under a chair. What is the meaning of this? Why is Julian's ex-wife in a Rothschild executive briefing? Jane didn't answer. She didn't look at Arthur. She didn't look at Victoria. And she didn't look at Julian. She walked straight to the head of the table, her gaze fixed entirely on the documents Edward was laying down before her. With a fluid, effortless grace, she slid into the high-backed leather CEO chair. The 5 directors sat down only after she took her seat. "Sit down," Jane said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried an icy, absolute weight that instantly anchored everyone to their seats. Julian remained standing, his chest heaving, his brain completely malfunctioning as it struggled to bridge the impossible gap between the submissive, quiet woman who used to cook his dinner in silence and the global titan sitting at the head of the world's most powerful boardroom. "Jane, what kind of sick joke is this?" Julian stammered, his face turning an ash-gray color. "How did you get in here? Security, get this woman out of here." "Mr. Vance," Uncle Edward interrupted, his tone laced with absolute pity and cold authority. "You are addressing Madam CEO Jane Sterling Rothschild. You are currently standing in her tower, at her table, breathing her air. I suggest you mind your tone in her boardroom before we have you removed permanently." $3.2 billion, Jane said softly, leaning back and weaving her fingers together over her chest. She finally raised her eyes, locking them onto Julian. Those eyes, they were completely devoid of the warmth, the longing, and the desperate compliance he had spent years exploiting. They were the eyes of a ruler, looking at an insect. "That is the current valuation of Vance Global's toxic debt," Jane stated flatly, her voice echoing in the freezing room. "And as of 9 a.m. this morning, my firm has officially acquired 41% of your public shares. You don't own your company anymore, Julian. I do." The revelation hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating fog, leaving the Vance family paralyzed in the silence of their own historic undoing.